Bulavanaka, everyone. Just give us a minute for everyone to get in the room and we'll kick off. All right, we've got 56 people in the room and climbing, so I'll kick off and say hello from myself and Dave Dewar, the two trade commissioners, as we like to be known in Suva. I'm representing Australia and Dave New Zealand, but we are, as I said last year at a seminar, Dave, we are peas in a pod. So you get one, you get both of us. There is a common turn of phrase that there's a lot going on in the Pacific in infrastructure. And since coming to this role about 18 months ago, I think it's become clear that, yep, there's a lot going on, but visibility is a real challenge for the private sector. And this Pacific Infrastructure webinar is actually one of the platforms and one of the solutions that we've got to address that visibility problem. And we're actually a little bit excited to show a bit of a new partnership. Historically, some of you might have seen the Pacific Project series, which Dave and I ran over the last few years. We've now got a new branding behind us here, which is the Pacific Infrastructure brand, which shows that we're trying to coordinate across the different development partners who are active in the Pacific. So you can see the logos of the ADB, the World Bank, the New Zealand and Australian governments, as well as the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility. We're all trying to talk together so we can show you, the private sector, that there is a lot going on, and we're trying to describe things in the same way, use the same platforms. So we're trying to coordinate for you. We also have other partners that are leveraging this platform, such as the EU. We're also working closely with the US and Japan, but today is the UNDP. So excited to be partnering with Vanil and the team to profile the Fiji Rural Electrification Fund. It's a really impactful project, and I'm excited to learn more about it alongside you today. I do just want to mention before we launch into Vanil, which is, I know, what we're all here to do, I just want to give a quick plug that there are other ways of staying across the raft of information on Pacific infrastructure news. Austrade, who I represent, and NZTE from Dave's perspective, we have different platforms, different newsletters to keep you up to date on what's going on, what tenders have gone to market, who's winning what, all that sort of stuff. If you have those sorts of questions, do get in touch with us. There are other support mechanisms as well, of which the Australia Fiji Business Council, the Australia Pacific Islands Business Council, the Australia PNG Business Council, as well as their New Zealand counterparts, all exist as well to represent the private sector in the region. So there are a lot of supports out there, as much as it is a big sector and there is a lot going on to keep you across the brief. On to today, though. So the format for today is I'm about to hand over to Vanil from the UNDP. He's the project manager and the lead for the Fiji Rural Electrification Fund. He will have the floor for about half an hour. He's got a presentation to talk you through. Then it'll go into a Q&A. There won't be an ability to come off mute, but you can put your questions in the chat down the bottom. And Dave, my counterpart, will host the Q&A session for the second half of the hour. And then we'll conclude with a couple of minutes to go. So with that, that's enough from me. Let's get to the star of the show, Vanil. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tim. And Bulavanaka, everyone. As has been mentioned, I have about 30 minutes, so I'll get straight into it. I'll share my screen. I have a slide deck for you to basically run through. Right? Okay, so my agenda today, or my purpose today, is to give you an overview of the Fiji Electrification Fund, and in particular, what are some of the prevailing opportunities that would be in place for private sector partners to be able to participate in this important development objective for Fiji. So I am presenting on behalf of the Fiji Department of Energy, who were not able to make this event due to prior commitments, but they will definitely be looking through the recordings. So with that, let me begin firstly by explaining what are the problems. What are the problems that the Fiji Electrification Fund seeks to address? So with that said, the first thing that comes to mind rather is that there's about 191,000 households in Fiji, of which 4% does not have access to electricity. And of that 4%, that equates to around 7,183 households that are either located in rural areas, too far away from the national electricity grid, or on one of the 110 maritime islands that is not served by the national utility provider. And with that said, of the 96% that has electricity, about 2,900 households, just under 3,000, use diesel gensets, and about 13,000, which that number has now climbed to around 14,000, use individual solar home systems. So basically a pine pole with a solar panel attached to it, providing a maximum of 300 watt hours of electricity per day. So with that, not only do we want to be able to target or provide electricity to the last 4%, which is our target population or beneficiary for FREF, but also looking at the 96% that are using diesel gensets and solar home systems to help transition them away from rather mundane sources or non-renewable sources of electricity to clean sources of electricity using ideally mini-grid solutions from renewable energy. So with that said, not only electricity is a problem, but we're actually trying to tackle a trifecta of issues. The first being electricity, the second being water. So in Fiji, about 497 households use unprotected wells. 1,926 use unprotected spring water, and these are all for primary drinking sources. 15,000 use communal tanks. Around 7,000 use untreated boreholes, and the most alarming, at least in my opinion, in this day and age, is 4,800 use open surface water for primary drinking. And so the intention here is not only to support rural communities to get access to electricity, but also to be able to use that electricity rather to provide clean water and sanitation solutions to rural communities as well. So that's the second problem. And the third problem that we're trying to tackle, the trifecta of the problems, is digital connectivity. Now, in this day and age, this is definitely a basic necessity for communities to be able to be connected, to be able to receive and deliver digital solutions that basically are the backbone of all services that is being provided by not only government but other private entities. The idea here is to be able to improve digital connectivity by using solar mini grids as a source of power, as a source of electricity. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is actually the mobile service coverage for Fiji. And so as you look from the top left of the screen to the right and to the bottom, 2G coverage, 3G coverage, 4G coverage, you'll see that 2G coverage is well and good, ideally. But as you move on from 3G to 4G, which basically is now the basic standard for delivery of digital solutions, the coverage declines quite significantly. And so the heat map that you're seeing here, green being good connectivity, yellow being relatively well, and red being marginal connectivity, you'll see that a lot of dark spots emerge. And so what are the solutions to this trifecta of problems? What is the solution? Basically, FREF, or the Fiji Electrification Fund, proposes a horizontal and vertical approach to this solution. So the horizontal approach here is that FREF seeks to provide centralized application solutions using underground cables, basically, to each of the households in a community. So essentially, you would have, say, ideally, a group of at least minimum of 65 households in a community that would be connected to a centralized generation source, a renewable energy generation source. and each of them would then be connected to this source and would be monitored remotely by a smart meter solution. And that would be, of course, the primary load for the energy that would be generated. And then on top of that, the horizontal integration being the auxiliary services, as we say, as we refer to, which would be the digital connectivity. So, for example, 4G connectivity using either mobile towers or remote satellite technology that is now prevailing quite significantly. Also, water and sanitation solutions such as desalination plants, etc., and also economic activity solutions, particularly things like solar freezers for fishing communities, processing centers for agricultural communities, etc. So all of this additionally add to the anchor load for the services that we would want to roll out through FREF, the Fiji Electrification Fund. Now, again, we will refer to auxiliary services or productive energy use cases quite significantly throughout this presentation. And they basically, as I mentioned earlier, is or are being referred to the 4G connectivity or digital connectivity, water and sanitation solutions, and economic case solutions that we would want to power through the mini grid as well. So all of these solutions actually help to target the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN system seeks to accelerate by 2030. That's something that we really wanted to highlight on this slide as well. But let's talk about the market opportunities. All of those things that I've just mentioned comes from a development spectrum, the development challenges that we want to address, but from a market spectrum for private sector, what is the opportunity? Now, FREF seeks to target, or rather seeks to electrify 399 rural communities across Fiji, and these are the 399 communities mapped on a single map, basically. Of those 399 communities, what we have done to date is we have been able to visit 75 of those to be able to create a good base case scenario of what would be the general cost estimates, the logistical issues, the communal issues, etc., that would be coming up to basically put together a case in front of you today. And the market is huge for Fiji. Like I said, 399 communities, of which 75 have been visited. As we progress through the slides, I'll explain to you we're taking a phased approach to electrify each of those sites. But the point that I would like to make in my next slide is that we won't be tackling each of the 399 communities all at once. We'll take a phased approach. And what we've done is we've clustered these 399 communities according to their geographical location, their propensity to pay, their ability to be able to use electricity in the best way possible. There's various parameters, etc., that we have used to be able to cluster these communities. Now, when we will be going out to market to tender for these sites and to be able to get potential bidders for these sites, they will be tendered at the cluster level. So you won't be tendering or putting in a tender for village 1, 2, 3, or 4. You'll be actually putting in a tender for cluster 1, which could hypothetically be Kandavu 1 cluster, Kandavu 2 cluster, Kandavu 3 cluster. Each of those clusters would have a minimum of at least 6 to 7 villages. And the idea for clustering is that we would want to be able to not only have a engineer procure construct solution, but also a long-term operational maintenance solution as well, which I will explain later in the next few slides. Moving on, basically those, as I mentioned, that the 399 communities will be electrified using a phased approach. So round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4, and subsequently, it depends on the funds that the Fiji Electrification Fund is able to mobilize. We would want to be able to roll this out across sort of a staggered approach across the years. So the presentation today will be focusing on round 1, which is the 2025-2026 horizon. Round 1 is divided into 2 stages of tender. And we will be targeting, round 1 will be targeting 20 sites. So just going back, of the 399 sites, we have visited 75. Of those 75 sites, we seek to electrify 20 sites in round one. The expected electrification for the remaining 75 minus 20 sites will be in round two, round three, and subsequently going forward to be able to build up to the 399 sites. Now, round one is, as I mentioned, will be divided into two stages of tender. Stage one will be looking at a 3-site tender, which we hope to be going to market in the next week and a half to 2 weeks. Stage two will be looking at 17 sites tender. The reason why we're beginning with stage one tender with 3 sites is because we want to be able to test the market, understand what are the responses like, and then eventually scale the tendering process, scale up the stages quite significantly. So basically, hypothetically speaking, and this is not set in stone, but round two could look at single tenders going up to even 30 to 40 sites. But it all depends on what would be the market response for stage one, stage two, and round one. Now, let me get into stage one and stage two. What do I mean by that, and what does it entail? So stage one. Stage one tender process, again, this is just a general slide, by the way, before I get into stage one. Process is that we would like to electrify 20 communities, as I mentioned, in the round one. The overall capex cost is expected to be somewhere around 19.1 million USD, of which we have been able to resource mobilize for about $7.3 million, and the remaining $11.8 million is what we will be mobilizing through a combination of bilateral financiers and private capital. The 20 communities that we seek to electrify is expected to electrify about 6,500 households, or rather 6,500 beneficiaries and over 550 households. And bring in an installed capacity of around 200 megawatts of clean electricity, be able to electrify at least 15 rural communities and health centers, set up across around 20 or support around 20 businesses in these rural areas, and set up 20 digital communication centers in these rural communities. And what do I mean by those digital communication centers? Each of those solar mini grids that we will be putting into these rural communities would need to have a digital connectivity solution. So when the tender goes out, it'll be divided into 2 lots. So lot 1 will be looking at the solar solution, and lot 2 will be looking at a digital communication solution. So basically a solution that would allow for remote monitoring of the system, but also providing a little bit of a community Wi-Fi mechanism for these communities as well, that would be powered through the solar system. So when the tender goes out, you can't just bid for lot 1, lot 2, you'll have to bid for the entirety of it. So if you're a solar company, you would be encouraged to partner up with a telecommunications company to basically bid for this tender, or vice versa. Now, with 2 megawatts of electricity at minimum installed across the 20 communities, we expect to have about 2.92 gigagrams of carbon reduction based on our general calculations that we have done here in Fiji. Now, like I said, those 20 sites are divided into stage 1 and stage 2 tender. So let me zoom into stage 1. Stage 1 tender will be looking at electrifying 3 sites, and the timelines are as follows. In February, we have gotten the necessary approvals from our technical committee and the Fiji Electrification Fund board to advertise the tender. So we hope to be able to advertise at least by end of this month or first week of March. And between April and June, by the way, before I say that, the tender will be open for only a month. The reason being it's just 3 sites. And between April and June, we would be closing the tenders, doing the bid evaluations and ranking those tenders. And subsequent decisions will be made on the ideal bidder who would be successful. And between July and August 2025, we will be doing final contractual negotiations and issuing the contract to the bidder. And there'll be a signing amount, about upfront 20 to 30% signing amount for the winning bidder to begin pre-procurement, and also to do some of the optics around groundbreaking, etc. At this point, between milestone 2 and milestone 3, we would expect to have contractual negotiations between the winning bidder to electrify those three sites in parallel at once. So we don't expect the bidder to go in and do site one, site two, and then site three. Because of the timelines that are there, we expect the bidders to basically bid, or rather to construct all three sites at once, and for all the construction work to be completed by November, which is milestone 4. So the Fiji Electrification Fund and UNDP in particular will work with the winning bidder to get the necessary energy generation and retail license from the national electricity provider. This tender process will basically be an EPC O&M contract. So basically engineer, procure, construct, and operate and maintain for at least a 5 to 7 year horizon. The idea here is that all of the capital cost will be borne by FREF. So basically 100% of the capital cost would be funded. The potential bidder is required to come in and build and to operate for at least 5 to 7 years. With that said and done, we hope to be able to move into stage 2 tender in parallel as well, and that I will discuss shortly. But the 3 sites that we want to be able to electrify under stage 1 tender are as follows. The first site is on Kiowa, the island of Kiowa in Vanuatu, near Vanuatu rather. The second site is Yadata in Lomaiviti, and the third site is in Yandrana in Laos. So that's the first 3 sites we will be electrifying. They don't necessarily fall under any particular cluster, but they have been deliberately selected to be able to ascertain what would be the overall cost structures needed to be able to move into stage 2 tender. Now, just zooming into each of those 3 sites, the village of Yandrana on Lakemba Island, that's basically at the bottom right of the screen in Lao Group. It has 350 people there. We've got the gender breakdown there as well, the number of households, the total number of public buildings. So the number of households minus the number of total public buildings, you'll get the overall public building figure. So 82 minus 78, that's the public buildings being schools, health centers, etc. We've also done our preliminary on-ground assessment, and we expect a minimum system sizing of around 78.4 kilowatts of electricity needed in that particular community. The main source of income being fishing and tourism for that community, for those of you who are interested in understanding the socioeconomic dynamics of the community. The second village, or rather the largest of the 3 villages or communities, is Salia village on Kiowa Island. That's on the middle of the screen, right at the top. Kiowa has 411 households. 411 people, 110 households, 136 public buildings. So basically 136 minus 110, that's the number of public buildings. The sizing required here is 118 kilowatts. And again, the main income source for this community being fishing and tourism. Yadata, which falls between Yandrana and Kiowa, right in the middle, it has a household or the population size of 270 people and 61 households. Public buildings in total being 68, so 68 minus 61, you'll get the number of public buildings. And the total system sizing is around 78.4 kilowatts as well. Relatively speaking, they are of the same size. Yadata is of the same size as Yandrana generally. The main income source being fishing. So with that, we'll move on to the stage, move on to just giving you an example of the work that we have already done to prepare for the tender. So in the tender documents, what you should expect is the proposed or suggested schematic designs for a solar system, solar PV system solution. Each of the sites have undergone technical assessments to understand what would be the basic load demand. Each of the sites have also undergone geotech surveys for the proposed site. So there's a proposed site here in the middle, just in the center of the screen in red. that proposed site has already gone through geotech assessment, so that you will not need to, as a bidder, to do geotech. So all of this information will be available publicly as part of the tender process. This is just the suggested design. We don't, through the tender process, we don't expect the bidders to stick to this. We expect you to come up with innovative solutions, to come up with approaches that would basically provide the minimum system sizing needed, which is, for example, for the village that you are seeing right now, Kiowa would be 118 kilowatts. But the point being is we need you to provide solutions that would be, of course, fit for purpose. So that's just an example. We've done similar schematics, similar mappings for the remaining two sites as well. So that is something that you should expect in the tender documents, already done and delivered for you to basically put in a robust bid. Now, that's stage one. I want to talk about a little bit about what is in store for stage two, which would be slightly different. And stage two is going to look like this. We have, in February 2025, we have already selected the 17 sites that need to have 22 sites that we have shortlisted. But 5 of the sites are basically sitting as spares. We won't be touching them. We won't be going to market for them. We will be going to market for the 17 sites. And between March to May, milestone 2 is to be able to do the technical visitations for each of the 17 sites, to develop the schematics, to develop the tender documents. And from June to September to actually advertise the tenders. So basically, what you could expect from us is that a 17-site tender would be advertised between June and say July, and the tender process to be open for at least 1.5 months to 2 months, because of the fact that it's a larger spectrum or collection of sites, and to be able to do the necessary shortlistings and approval of the selected bidder by October, November, and construction work to begin from December and continuing up until May 2026. So these are the 17, the broad timelines for the 17 sites. In the interest of time, I'm breezing through it. I understand that this slide deck and the recordings will be available to you. So you can zoom into the details of each of these milestones and come back to us with potential questions later on if you want to. But what is the general business model behind stage 2 tender? Now, I had said earlier that the stage 1 tender will be 100% capital funding, completely funded by FREF, Fiji Electrification Fund. And the contractor or the bidder would be required to basically just construct and do operational maintenance for at least 5 to 7 years. However, under stage 2 tender, it's slightly different. Now, this is where we would need you to basically bear with us. So as I mentioned earlier, the business model for stage 1 here is that funds will come through, say, potential bilateral partners like Australia and New Zealand coming into FREF, and FREF will hand over the funds to UNDP, where we will be advertising for tender. The stage 1 tender will be generally a EPC O&M contract. Apologies, it says build, operate, transfer model. It should be EPC and O&M contract, where 100% of the grants will be coming from FREF, as I mentioned earlier, and the ownership structure of the mini grids will be retained with FREF. The contractor will be required to maintain and operate the system, it should say, for 5 to 7 years, not 8 to 10, apologies. And then basically have the ability to have the O&M contract renewed, or FREF will, as an entity, will advertise for a new O&M contract or new O&M contractor. So that's stage 1. But stage 2 is a little different. Now, this is how it will look for stage 2. And I'll spend a little bit of time here because it is a new approach that we are taking, generally speaking, where the Fiji Electrification Fund will provide up to 80% of the capital grants to construct a solar system. So basically, say, hypothetically speaking, if it costs $100,000 to build a solar system in a community, FREF will put forward 80% of the capital grants, whereas the private sector or the business partner that would be bidding for the 17 sites would need to work up onshore, or rather work on shoring up 20% of the private capital cost, so $20,000 for that matter, if it's a $100,000 hypothetical system you're putting in place. Now, that's the sort of the general overall structure here. And the reason why we wanted to have or proposing a special purpose vehicle modality is that we would like the private sector company to have some sort of a joint partnership with the village that would be benefiting from this activity. The reason being is that we would want long-term partnership between the village and the solar system provider to be able to run the system in unison with the village. There needs to be some skin in the game for the private sector provider and the village to run the system on their own. And so what we are proposing here is that the private sector bidder would need to get into a joint venture with the village. That is something that the Fiji Electrification Fund and UNDP will be helping to broker. And the point being is that entirety of the construction of the solar system would be split into two parts: 80% grant contribution, capital grant coming from the Fiji Electrification Fund, and 20% of the funds being put forward by the private entity. And the intention here is that the entire ownership of the system itself will not this time be retained by FREF, as is under stage 1 tender. All of the ownership will be handed to the SPV. And so, or the private entity, depending on how the SPV is structured. The intention here is to be able to have the community put up their land as equity as part of the SPV, and the private sector entity or private entity putting up the capital in collaboration with the community to run the SPV or the solar system on their own. So that's the general structure, and I know that there'll be questions around this quite a lot. So I'm happy to delve deep into this. But in the interest of time, I'll move on to basically my next slide, which is basically saying thank you for your attention. We're hitting the 28-minute mark for my presentation, and I know that there's a lot of questions, so I'm happy to open the floor up for Q&A to discuss this further. Right back at you, Tim, for you to proceed further.
Yeah, look, thank you, Vanil. I'll jump in here now, David Dewar from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. And look, what a fantastic way to start off the year with this Pacific Infrastructure webinar series. Really interesting project. And I have to commend you as well on the incredible graphics on your slideshow, Vanil. They're definitely some of the more interesting ones to look at of any of those that we've seen. But also fantastic attendance here today. We've got, I think, at least well over 90 attendees on the line. So that really shows you the interest in this topic and in this part of the world. And reflecting that as well, I think we've got a heck of a lot of questions in the chat already. Sometimes these webinars can start a bit slowly, but never in Fiji. I think everyone always jumps straight into some really meaty questions. Vanil, I had a couple as well that I was thinking of just as you were sort of talking, and hopefully you can hear me. So if we just deal with stage 1 first, there's just a few sort of questions there around the scope of the project and who will be doing what. So can I just check who's actually doing the procurement part of the stage 1 stage? Is it UNDP itself, or is it FREF, or is it the Fiji government? And who will the eventual contract be with? Let's just deal with stage 1 for now.
Sure. The procurement itself will be run through UNDP. So all FREF procurement for even for stage 1 and stage 2 will be run by UNDP. We will be selecting the preferred bidder, etc., through UNDP rules, procurement rules, and procedures. The contract for stage 1, the EPC and O&M contract for stage 1 between the contractor, or rather with the contractor, will be with FREF. So FREF and the contractor will have the EPC O&M contract going. For the stage 2 tender, I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead, David, but might as well just clear this. For stage 2 tender, the ownership structure or the contract will be between the UNDP and the solutions provider to initially build the system, and the operations of the operational contract of the system would actually be with FREF. So it's divided into two, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, thanks, Vanil. I think yeah, that structuring kind of point will be a critical part of the sort of market sounding exercise. So very useful just to have a think about that. And in terms of so just that scope piece, how are you packaging that original tender? Let's take stage 1 for now. Are they 3 individual tenders for each site, or is there a possibility for one bidder to put in for all 3, or would they have to do so individually?
Sure, it's actually a package tender, so all 3 will need to be put forward. So a bidder cannot choose between 1, 2, or 3 sites. They have to bid for all 3 sites together.
Awesome. The next thing goes to a few of the questions that are already in the Q&A box, because there's a bit of interest here, I think, in tariff setting and metering, and how the power is going to be paid for. So I guess a first clarification is for stage 1, we're not talking about an independent power producer that then on sells the electricity, are we? This is purely a construction capital works piece. How is FREF going to kind of deal with the metering and on sale of power to the communities? Is that something that's kind of being factored in?
Sure, yes. So as part of our support to the National Energy Regulator, which is the FCCC and Fiji, we have helped them to develop a national rural mini grid framework, as well as a tariff structure that is already in place. That was done, say, over prior to this work being done. And so, to answer your question, for stage 1 tender, the ownership structure will be retained with FREF, and so the private entity doesn't have to worry about getting an energy generation or retail license. That is something that FREF will do as an entity. We will work with FCCC to get an energy generation retail license, because the ownership of the grid itself will lie with FREF. And the tariff as well will, the tariff determination and the tariff being generated or determined by FCCC will be for FREF. Now, how will the tariff be collected? As part of the tender that would be coming out for stage 1, one of the key things that we would require is for the contractor to put up a billing system in place that would be integrated to the smart meter. So the revenue that would be generated would go into the FREF account, and then FREF will pay an O&M fees to the operator to operate the system. So essentially, in a nutshell, the whole tariff collection system or tariff will be digital or digitized, will be through mobile money solutions, and the O&M contract that would be with FREF would have a O&M fee for the provider, and that would be paid by FREF to the O&M provider.
And Vanil, just on your point about smart meters, one of the questions in the chat there is, is there a particular meter that will be specified, or is that up to proposers to suggest a technology that they might be wanting to use?
Sure. So the other thing that I tried to highlight a lot in my presentation was the fact that the tenders that come out provide minimum standards, or basically standards that we would require the bidder to adhere to, but the bidder is free to suggest any type of meters or any type of equipment, etc., that is either at or above the standards that are stipulated or in the tender document. So that is something that the bidders would be able to find out once they go through the tender document.
Thanks, Vanille. And that kind of goes to another question that's been in one of the first ones that we had posted in the Q&A, which is this a design and build tender? And so effectively, if I interpret what you're saying correctly, does that mean that you're specifying sort of like a minimum standard that has to be met, but it is actually open to prospective suppliers to propose a design that will deliver the outcome that you're seeking to achieve and then build it should they win? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Now, I guess there's a few questions in there just around the mechanics of the what's sort of provided on the ground, what's kind of envisaged in terms of who's going to be agreeing to things. So, first question for me is for stage one. Land availability, does FREF take care of providing a site that can be used, or is it going to be up to the suppliers to negotiate where and how they install whatever's necessary in terms of paneling within the village? And if so, with whom should they be talking and negotiating with around some of those land issues?
Sure, I think that's one of the most fundamental questions, David. For both stage one and stage two tender, the FREF will take the responsibility to arrange for the land with the community, and to the point where we will also do geotech surveys as well for the land, and that would already be done and dusted as part of the tender process. So that burden doesn't fall on the bidder.
And can I then extrapolate that out, because there's a question in there also in the Q&A about the JV agreement when you get into stage two in your SPVs. Is there going to be a nominated authorised person or group within the village communities that'll be delegated to negotiate those agreements? Or is that going to be on the suppliers to actually identify the right people to form the SPV with?
Right. And that's, again, another great question. So one of the things that FREF is working on is working with the Ministry of Ethiopian Affairs, or the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, for those who are dialed in not too familiar with ministries in Fiji. And the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs will be representing the community to come up with an ideal SPV solution. So they are already part of the FREF board, or the FREF management structure, and they will help the potential bidders to come up with a JV negotiation. I think if I may, David, also answer a question that is in the chat, is that if there is a split, percentage split within the JV ownership, the answer is no, there's no specific split for that. It all depends on the negotiation per se with the community. So again, to answer your question, the bidders will basically have to liaise with FREF to be able to get into that JV negotiation. And FREF will be nominating the Ministry of Ethiopian Affairs, Indigenous Affairs, to do that negotiation on behalf of the community. If that makes sense, I'm happy to delve deeper into that if you want.
And do you think that will devolved responsibility will also include all of the necessary cultural protocols around engagement with the local communities, for example, Sevu Sevu and others? Is that
Absolutely,
intent?
absolutely correct. Absolutely correct, because there are various cultural sensitivities when you work with such communities, and that's one of the reasons why we have deliberately and very consciously partnered with the Ministry of Ethiopian Affairs, who would be able to guide and I would say, for lack of a better term, handhold the bidders in this negotiation process to make sure that there's no cultural insensitivities occurring.
Thanks, Vanille. There's a few questions in there also, shifting tack slightly to energy mix and different types of generation. So the first one in there is to ask whether there is any scope to consider other means of renewable generation, or is this just a solar project? And then secondly, a related question is, what is the role of backup diesel? So is there any intent to have a backup diesel genset included in the bids, or is this a wholesale removal of any kind of backup fossil fuel generated electricity?
Sure, David, would you just I got the backup diesel one, but what was the first question again?
The first one was firstly, are there any other generation technologies being considered?
Right. So for stage 1 and stage 2 tender, all our technical assessments point towards solar being the preferred system or preferred energy source. And the tenders have been designed accordingly. So while FREF as an organization on its own is not married to a solar solution, we for stage 1 and stage 2 tender, that's the solution that's being pointed towards. And for the backup diesel question, all of the sites will have or will need, depending on the solution that the bidders put forward, but there is an opportunity for the bidders to put forward backup diesel as a backup for that matter. We would want the solar system to take up or provide or be cater for the primary load. But if there are, say, instances where the system may not be generating enough load on a not so ideal weather day, then of course the backup diesel generators can be a solution that the bidders can design into the system that they would be proposing.
Okay, and so you'll leave that as an option for bidders to put forward, or will that be kind of specified in the tender? Removed from your price component. Here's either an existing diesel generation capacity that you can use, or a separate price for an additional one.
We would for all even for sites that already have, say, a village diesel genset running, we would not rely on that. So the entire tender process would require, or the tender process would require entirely new diesel gensets and systems and solutions, because we do not necessarily guarantee the longevity and the reliability of existing solutions in the communities, because they have been there for a long period of time. We do not know what would be the overall reliability of the infrastructure that's already there. So we would require potential bidders to factor in the fact that if diesel gensets are going to be put in as part of the solution, it needs to be new. We won't be working off existing diesel gensets. However, the reticulation and wiring that is already in the communities is something that we have inspected as part of our technical work. And in the bidding documents, the bidders will be able to find out that, say of the 3 villages that would be tendered in stage 1, 2 might have excellent reticulation already in place, and that is something that the bidders do not have to put forward. So that's specified in the tender documents.
So, okay, so you'll be clearly specifying in the tender documents the extent to which reticulation and wiring will be or not part of the scope of the project, eh? Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Thanks, Vinil. So, just to clarify a couple of other questions that have come in around the costs that FREF will meet. So, firstly, there's a question in there to ask whether the contractor, whether it's FREF or whomever, will be covering charter services to get materials to site, or if that needs to be factored into the supplier's cost. And then secondly, just to confirm whether the cost of land acquisition is definitely met by FREF, should it need to be purchased.
Sure. So all logistics costs will need to be factored in by the bidder. FREF will not take care of that as part of its capital grant, etc. Or rather, it will, but it needs to be factored into the bidder's cost structure. The logistical arrangements, everything else, it's up to the bidder to arrange for that. And secondly, the cost of land procurement. That is something, of course, that FREF will handle. That's part of our negotiations with the community to be able to make sure that before we do go out to market, the acquisition needs, etc., will be taken care of.
Oh, thanks, Vinil. And I guess just getting to a series of questions really around kind of the governance arrangements once this thing is implemented. So to the extent that, and you mentioned this before, you touched on it before with talking about the tariff structure and all of that. In terms of any necessary power production license, IPP license, and the like in order to charge households and consumers and things like that. Will that be taken care of entirely by FREF, or is the supplier intended to have that responsibility and licensing as part of its operational role in maintaining the infrastructure? And is that the case between stage 1 and stage 2, or does that differ?
Yeah, for stage 1, it differs because FREF will be taking on the energy generation and retail licensing, and basically it'll hire the potential bidder to operate and maintain the system on its behalf. But for the stage 2 tender, that's where the full ownership of the system will be handed over to the proposed JV. Then it's up to the bidder to be able to secure the energy generation retail license. What FREF will do is support the bidder to do this. We will try and broker discussions and negotiations with FCCC. But in stage 2, the onus will eventually be on the private bidder to be able to get those licenses in place.
And as part of that,
So have I answered the...
as part of that state, sorry, Vanel.
Go ahead,
sorry,
David.
Oh, I was just sort of following on from that question really around the stage 2 piece, which is, establishing much more, I guess, of a private market type mechanism for sale of power. What sort of have you done any kind of studies on the ROI or potential ROI based on kind of current input costs for diesel generation that could inform the potential tariff settings and things like that? You did allude to, I think, some studies that had been done on some tariff settings that FREF uses. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. There's a couple of questions about that there.
Sure. So one of the things that FREF has done over the past 18 months is conducted this desktop and on-ground studies. And so as part of the resources that would be available for the bidders to read through, there are a few things that is available. So number one is a desktop analysis of the site clustering approach. What would be the potential revenue sources, etc., that would be be able to be generated from these communities, and the ROI numbers. So this is at the desktop level. Those studies will be available as part of the tender package. The second thing that's available is site-specific information that has in collaboration with the Arizona State University and the Global Green Growth Institute, where they've been able to drill down to each of the 17 sites that would be tendered in stage 2, and also in stage 1, the 3 sites. What is the income source? What is the amount that each household generates per month? What would be the ROI potential for a particular tariff rate, etc.? So all of those information has been put forward in a study that will also be available for the bidder to be able to assess and ascertain what would be the potential financial returns that they would be getting, particularly when you talk about stage 2 tendering, where ownership will be with the bidders.
Thanks, Vanil. Now, look, everyone, in the interest of time, we have 5 minutes left and there's quite a few questions to get through. Can I ask my fellow panelists on there from UNDP if you would like to go through and type some of the answers to some of these questions that I think have some quite quick ones? For example, some of the specifics around the tendering and what information would be available. So Ashneil and Patrick, I'll invite you to go through and type some answers to some of those easier questions. My question is really now for you, Vanil, around the what the procuring authorities are looking for in terms of a good supplier, local connection, I suppose, to the community, because there's a little bit in there, some of these questions around, what sort of focus will you put on having a local presence in Fiji, and that kind of connection to the community in terms of waiting for procurement.
Sure. One of the things that we would require the if, for example, if it's an international bidder, we would require the international bidder to have local conduits or local partnerships with say a preferred entity that has experience in doing solar or rural telecommunications. The reason being is that there's a lot of on-ground community maneuvering and discussions needed. And so international bidders will need to demonstrate that they have got a domestic partner in place to be able to do this work in unison, in conjunction.
Yep. Thanks, Vanil. And there was one second part to that question that I just asked you, which just asked you to clarify the terms of the operate and maintain contract, which, you'll have a contract to a certain point, but obviously the life of the asset will continue beyond that. Is the intention basically to re-let that contract at the end of the term, possibly to another operator?
Yes, correct. So it depends on the existing operator. Preference will be given to the existing operator at the life of the at the end life of the O&M contract, whether they want to have it renewed. Of course, that also depends on the performance of the contractor. If for some reason whatsoever the existing contractor cannot continue, then we would re-advertise and be able to, or rather, look for a new contractor per se.
Yeah, thanks, Vanil. That's a helpful clarification. There's a comment, well, sort of a half question, half comment in here, saying that your time frame looks very optimistic, which I hope is a good thing. But is there any scope to consider, suppliers putting forward alternate time frames when sort of pitching in their ideas, maybe based on something that they think could be more realistic?
Sure. We are open to suppliers providing alternative timeframes. Again, we respect the fact that they are the ones working on the ground and have a better pulse on how things may work from a logistical and execution standpoint. However, we do not want a massive divergence from the timelines that have been proposed. As long as they are reasonably divergent, that's fine.
Yeah, fantastic. And I see our colleagues are going through and sort of typing some of the answers here now, which is fantastic. There's one question in here with going back to that subject of metering. Has there been any study on the existing sort of stability of the networks in the preferred sites, and will that need to be factored in, I guess, to the supply solution that's proposed?
Sure. So if it means the stability of the electricity network, then a lot of these sites are either have energy solutions existing that are not going to be used at all. Basically, they, like I mentioned earlier, FREF will be going for a new system solution. Everything will be new apart from the reticulation. So then I do not see a need to be able to understand the system reliability per se. All of the information, site-specific information on what's existing on the islands will be provided as part of the studies that would be part of the tender documents or tender package. So I would suggest, or rather I would say that really isn't relevant information that we would need to consider in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, Vanil. We are coming towards the end. Look, I'm not gonna. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions that are coming in. We've got 1 minute to go. I'm going to take one more question, which is this one about any sort of, I guess, risk insurance that FREF is considering for potential non-payment throughout the SPV, or is that something that just gets covered as part of the governance arrangements for that stage 2?
Correct. That's a great question. So one of the things that we were thinking about was to create a sinking fund as some sort of a guarantee for SPVs not being paid. But that is something that we would at the moment has not been developed that well. We would require the bidders to basically, in the absence of such a mechanism, we would require the bidders to be able to put up some sort of a solution where they would have some reserve funds or etc. that they would require FREF support in creating, so that they can dip into those for some reason if the SPV is not able to show up the funds.
Thanks, Vanil. Look, that's an incredibly large amount of questions. There's still more there, not enough to answer in the course of an hour. So I would encourage those that are still asking, if you are an NZTE customer, please feel free to contact myself at NZTE. If you're an Austrade client, obviously feel free to follow up with Austrade, but also we'll be circulating some further information after this, as we always do with these webinars, and there'll be an opportunity to follow up after the fact. But otherwise, I think hopefully this shows that there's a heck of a lot of interest in this project. So I'll hand back to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. This is just a vote of thanks for you, Vanil. Thanks for coming along and testing the interest of the market. It seems like the market's very interested. There's also a question in there around when we might do another webinar. We actually try and time these webinars so the tender's not out yet. We can be quite open and talk about what the hopes and dreams of what the UN is trying to do. Once the tender's out, then it sort of goes to a centralized email and is much more kind of by the book. So I really appreciate Vanil coming along, talking about the ambition that the UNDP and the various other parties have for this initiative. As Dave says, Austrade's always here to help. So please get in touch if you're an Australian business looking to learn more. But for now, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Vanil, and thanks for everyone for attending. Ngaka waka levu.